Michael's hometown. The narrow dirt path twisted and turned through dense woods, the trees pressing in like silent spectators to her every step. She sat in the passenger seat of Michael's car, her breath fogging up the window as she stared out into the creeping darkness. "Do you really think this is a good idea?" Michael asked, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "You're the one who told me about it," Sophie replied, her voice laced with excitement. "The bridge, the crying woman. How could I not investigate? This could be my big break." From the back seat, Clara, Michael's 16-year-old sister, let out a dramatic groan. "You're seriously taking her to the bridge, Mike? You know how people say it's cursed." "It's just a story," Sophie cut in, though a flicker of doubt crept into her voice. "Besides, I want to hear it for myself." Michael sighed but didn't argue. The car's headlights caught the edge of an old wooden sign, its paint peeling away. "Willow's Hollow Bridge, keep out." "This is it," Michael muttered, pulling the car to a stop. The trio stepped out into the night. The air was thick with moisture, and the fog curled around their ankles like ghostly tendrils. Sophie grabbed her flashlight from the glove compartment, clicking it on as they began walking toward the bridge. "All right," Clara said, stuffing her hands into her jacket pockets. "What's the plan? We just stand there until something spooky happens?" "Exactly," Sophie replied, her voice tinged with excitement. "Every legend has a seed of truth. Maybe we'll see something, maybe we won't. Either way, I'm getting this on record." She pulled a small voice recorder from her bag and clicked it on. As they walked, the faint sound of rushing water grew louder. The bridge came into view, a rickety wooden structure suspended over a narrow, fast-moving stream. Sophie stopped to take in the sight, her heart beating faster. "This is it," she whispered. Michael stood a few feet behind her, his face tense. "I really don't think this is a good idea, Soph." Clara rolled her eyes. "Oh, come on, it's just a stupid story. Some lady cries because her kid drowned. Big deal. People die all the time." "Clara!" Michael snapped. "That's enough." But Sophie barely noticed their bickering. She was transfixed by the atmosphere of the place. The creaking of the wooden planks in the breeze, the distant hoot of an owl, the oppressive stillness that seemed to hang over the bridge like a curse. She stepped onto the first plank. The wood groaned under her weight, sending a chill down her spine. "Do you feel that?" she asked, glancing back at the others. "Feel what?" Michael asked, his voice uneasy. "It's colder here," Sophie said, rubbing her arms. Before anyone could respond, a faint sound drifted through the fog, a soft, mournful cry. Clara froze. "Did you hear that?" Michael's eyes darted around the bridge, his breath coming in short gasps. "Let's go, right now." But Sophie held up her hand, silencing him. She stepped farther onto the bridge, her flashlight beam sweeping through the fog. "Wait, there's someone here." At the far end of the bridge, a figure began to take shape. It was a woman, her long, dark hair cascading over her shoulders. She wore a white dress, tattered and stained, and her head was bowed, hiding her face. "Who's there?" Sophie called, her voice trembling. The woman didn't respond. Instead, she raised a hand, pointing directly at Sophie. Clara grabbed Michael's arm. "We need to go, now!" But Sophie couldn't look away. The figure began to move toward them, gliding silently across the bridge. As she drew closer, the crying grew louder, more agonized, until it was nearly unbearable. "Sophie!" Michael shouted, snapping her out of her trance. The figure stopped abruptly, then let out a piercing scream that echoed through the night. In an instant, she vanished, leaving nothing but silence in her wake. The three of them stood frozen, their breaths ragged. Sophie's flashlight flickered, and then her beam landed on something carved into the railing of the bridge. "She knows your name." Sophie's blood ran cold. "What the hell does that mean?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sophie shook her head, backing away from the bridge. I don't know." Before anyone could say another word, the sound of crying started again. This time, closer. It seemed to come from all around them, echoing in the fog. Michael grabbed Sophie's arm. "We're leaving, now!" They turned and ran, the cries growing louder with every step. As they reached the car, Sophie glanced back toward the bridge. For a split second, she thought she saw the woman standing in the middle of the bridge, watching them. She didn't stop to look again. The screen fades to black, the sound of the crying growing softer and softer until it's replaced by silence. A single, jagged line of text appears. "Sometimes the past won't stay buried." The faint light of dawn filtered through the kitchen windows, but it did little to lift the oppressive atmosphere hanging over Michael's house. The three of them sat at the table in uneasy silence, the events of the night before still raw in their minds. Sophie stared down at her coffee cup, her fingers trembling as she turned the mug in her hands. The words on the bridge, "She knows your name," were seared into her memory. She hadn't slept, haunted by the phantom cries that seemed to echo in her ears long after they had left the bridge. "So," Clara finally broke the silence, her voice sharp with sarcasm. "What's the plan now, Sophie? Go back and ask her for an interview?" Michael shot her a glare. "Clara, enough. This isn't funny." "I'm not trying to be funny," Clara snapped. "You both dragged me into this, and now we're sitting here pretending it didn't happen? That thing on the bridge looked right at us." Sophie set her mug down with a clatter. "We need to figure out who she is." Michael's eyes widened in disbelief. "Are you serious? After everything we saw, you want to go digging deeper?" "Of course I do," Sophie shot back. "There's a reason she's there, a reason she hesitated, her voice faltering. "A reason she knew my name." Michael's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Clara sighed dramatically and stood up. "Fine, let's say you're right, and this is some ghost or whatever. Where do we even start?" Sophie pulled her laptop out of her bag and opened it on the table. "Legends like this usually have some basis in reality. There has to be a record, something about a woman disappearing or dying at that bridge." Michael hesitated, then nodded. "If anyone would know, it's Mrs. Langley. She's practically the town historian. We could talk to her." Sophie grabbed her notebook. "Perfect, let's go." Mrs. Langley's house was as old and weathered as the stories she told. The frail woman welcomed them into her sitting room, where the walls were lined with shelves full of dusty books and faded photographs. When Sophie mentioned the crying woman, Mrs. Langley's expression darkened. She leaned back in her chair, her bony fingers clutching a steaming cup of tea. "You've seen her, haven't you?" she asked, her voice low. Sophie hesitated. "Yes, at the bridge last night." Mrs. Langley sighed heavily, setting her cup down. "That would be Eliza. Poor girl. Her story is one of the darkest in this town's history." Michael shifted uneasily in his seat. "What happened to her?" "Eliza was a young mother. Back in the 1920s, Mrs. Langley began. She had a little boy, Samuel. They say she loved him more than anything in the world. But tragedy struck one cold autumn evening. Samuel fell into the river near the bridge and drowned." Sophie felt a lump form in her throat. "That's horrible." Mrs. Langley nodded. "It gets worse. The town turned against her. Some claimed it was an accident, but others whispered that she'd done it on purpose, that she'd thrown him in a fit of madness." Clara's eyes widened. "Did she?" "No one knows," Mrs. Langley said grimly, "but the accusations destroyed her. A few days later, she vanished. Some believe she took her own life at the bridge. Others say she cursed it before disappearing. And then the sightings began. The crying woman searching for her son." Sophie scribbled furiously in her notebook. "Do you think she's dangerous?" Mrs. Langley's gaze was piercing. "She's a spirit consumed by sorrow and rage. If you've seen her, she may have taken an interest in you." Michael paled. "What does that mean?" "It means you should leave her be," Mrs. Langley said firmly. "Eliza doesn't want company, only closure, and she'll take it however she can." That night, back at Michael's house, the tension was palpable. Sophie pored over her notes and old newspaper clippings she had found online. Stories of strange disappearances, unexplained drownings, and sightings of the crying woman painted a chilling picture. As the clock struck midnight, the house grew unnervingly quiet. Clara sat on the couch, scrolling on her phone, while Michael paced the room. "This feels wrong," he muttered. "We shouldn't have gone there. We shouldn't have—" The sound of soft crying cut him off. Sophie froze. "Did you hear that?" Michael nodded, his face pale. "It's coming from outside." The three of them exchanged nervous glances before Sophie grabbed her flashlight and headed toward the window. She pulled back the curtain, her heart hammering in her chest. There, in the middle of the yard, stood the woman in white. Her head was bowed, her dark hair hiding her face, but her presence was undeniable. The crying grew louder, more guttural, as if it were being torn from her very soul. "She's here," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. Suddenly, the woman lifted her head, revealing hollow, black eyes that seemed to stare straight into Sophie's soul. She raised a hand, pointing at the door. The house shook violently, as if some unseen force was trying to break in. Clara screamed, and Michael grabbed Sophie's arm. "We need to get out of here," he shouted. But Sophie couldn't move. The woman's gaze held her captive, and in that moment, a single thought consumed her mind. "She's not done with us." The house was suffocatingly quiet the next morning. Sophie sat at the kitchen table, her eyes bloodshot from another sleepless night. Michael leaned against the counter, his jaw tight, while Clara paced back and forth, biting her nails. None of them dared speak of what had happened. The crying woman had followed them home. Sophie broke the silence. "We have to go back to the bridge." Michael slammed his hand on the counter. "No, absolutely not. This thing, whatever it is, it's dangerous. We're not going back there." "She won't stop," Sophie said, her voice trembling but firm. "You saw her. She's not going to leave us alone. The only way to end this is to face her." Clara stopped pacing. "You mean, you want to talk to her?" Sophie nodded. "If she's still here, it's because she wants something. We have to find out what." Michael shook his head. "This is insane. Do you have a better idea?" Sophie shot back. Michael didn't answer. That night, they returned to the bridge. The fog was thicker than before, wrapping around them like ghostly fingers as they approached the wooden structure. Sophie clutched her flashlight, her heart pounding in her chest. "This is a bad idea," Michael muttered, but he didn't turn back. Clara shivered, pulling her jacket tighter. "Let's just get this over with." As they stepped onto the bridge, the sound of crying began, soft and mournful, drifting through the night like a lament. Sophie swallowed hard and took a step forward. "Eliza," she called, her voice shaking. "We know who you are. We know what happened to you. We just want to help." The crying stopped abruptly. The silence was deafening, pressing down on them like a weight. Then out of the fog, the figure of the crying woman appeared. She was closer this time, her tattered white dress swaying as if caught in an unseen breeze. Her head was bowed, her dark hair obscuring her face. "Eliza," Sophie said again, her voice steadier now. "We know about Samuel. We know you lost him." The woman raised her head slightly, her hollow eyes glinting in the dim light. The crying resumed, softer now, almost pleading. "What do you want?" Sophie asked. Eliza pointed to the river below. The rushing water seemed to grow louder, more chaotic, as if echoing her anguish. Michael stepped forward cautiously. "You want your son?" Eliza nodded slowly. Clara's voice was barely a whisper. "But he's gone. He drowned." At that, the woman's mournful cries turned to a guttural wail of anger. The bridge shook beneath them, the planks groaning as if under immense pressure. "Stop!" Sophie shouted, holding up her hands. "Please, we'll do whatever we can to help you. Just tell us what to do." Eliza pointed again, this time at Sophie. The air grew colder, and Sophie felt an invisible force pressing down on her chest. She gasped, clutching at her heart. Michael grabbed her arm. "Sophie, no! Don't listen to her!" "I have to," Sophie choked out, tears streaming down her face. "This is the only way." Clara grabbed Sophie's other arm. "What are you talking about?" Sophie looked at them, her eyes filled with despair. She wants a life. To end the curse, someone has to take her place. No, Michael said firmly. We'll find another way. There is no other way, Sophie whispered. It's me she wants. She's been calling my name since the beginning. Before they could stop her, Sophie wrenched free of their grasp and stepped toward Eliza. The woman's crying grew softer, almost gentle, as Sophie approached. Take me, Sophie said, her voice trembling but resolute. Let this end. Eliza reached out, her cold, translucent hand brushing against Sophie's cheek. For a moment, the ghostly figure seemed almost human. Then, in a flash of blinding light, both Sophie and Eliza vanished. Michael and Clara stood frozen, their breaths ragged. The bridge was silent now. The oppressive weight that had haunted them lifted. Sophie, Clara whispered, tears streaming down her face. Michael fell to his knees, staring at the spot where Sophie had stood. She's gone. Clara knelt beside him, her sobs filling the void left by the ghost's departure. The screen fades to the next morning. Michael and Clara sit on the edge of the bridge, the sunlight breaking through the fog for the first time in what feels like an eternity. Michael's phone buzzes in his pocket. He pulls it out and freezes. The caller ID reads, Sophie. He answers it, his hands shaking. Sophie, is that you? There's no response, only the faint sound of crying. The screen cuts to black, leaving the viewers with one final message. Some sacrifices never truly end.